Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad with Capitalism Hits Home, a podcast brought to you by Democracy at Work. Today, I want to talk about sex work and an analysis of sex itself. Actually, I want to do a class analysis. People think that Marxian categories like class could never apply to personal life, and certainly not to sex. But they can. And since sex work is a hot topic these days, so to speak, I want to talk about it. Now, the basic questions, the basic class questions are: who does the work, who benefits, and who gets to distribute the benefits as he wants or she wants. But the most basic questions are: who does the work, who benefits from that labor? And so that we can look at sex and sex work, asking those questions. Who does the work and who benefits? And you could say, wait a minute, sex isn't work. Well, according to Marx, work is the application of brain and muscle towards a goal. And certainly, sex is an exercise of brain and muscle towards a goal. And sex work can come in all different disguises, different ways. For example, it used to be that the sex work was kind of a slave aspect of marriage. Women had no choice. There was no such thing as marital rape. In fact, a woman's sexuality upon marriage belonged to her husband. And it took until 2000, the year 2000, for all the states to have rules against marital rape. Of course, marital rape is very hard to prove, and so it's very rarely a question of the courts, but at least it was on the books by the year 2000. And women's sexuality stopped being owned by her husband. Now, if we look at the different class processes, we can look at sex in each of them. You could look at sex in the slave class process. So, for example, sex-trafficked girls, and sometimes boys, but overwhelmingly girls, are often brought to this country, tricked into thinking that they'll get decent, well-paying jobs, and then multiply raped and forced into sex slavery, where they have to perform sex acts, and the money that is collected from the Johns goes to the slaveholder. Or, as a variation, a man can enslave someone sexually without getting any money for it, just force her to have sex with him and not let her go or have an independent life. There was a man who was discovered having captured several of his daughter's friends and taken them out of circulation. No one knew why they disappeared, but he sexually enslaved them and kept them in his basement, just for his own pleasure. There they were doing the sex work. They were trying to give him pleasure. And he owned their bodies as his property. He laid claim to them. That's sexual slavery. And slavery, it was an economic form widespread before feudalism. You can also have someone who is in the capitalist class process. You have all those brothels in Nevada where men and women work providing sexual enjoyment for customers, and they get paid a wage, and the capitalist owner of the brothel makes a lot more money than he or she ever gives them, because in capitalism, as we all know, it doesn't pay to hire you unless they're making more money off of you than they ever give you. And it's not only informal brothels, there are smaller brothel operations all over the United States. They may be illegal, but they're everywhere, where some people hire other people to work providing sexual acts, and the people who own the brothel, small or large operation, collect the money from the Johns and give the sex workers a small portion of that money. There's another class form that sex work takes, and that's a very widespread form, because the sugar industry, which is huge, and I'll talk about that later, more or less fits that description. In independent sex work, or what Marx called ancient class process of work, one person decides to sell his, her, or their sexuality in exchange for money that they take. They get the profit, and they get to spend that money however they want. They're a one-person sex operator, of which there are many all over the place. A variation of that is the sugar industry. The sugar industry is hundreds of thousands of people. The most prominent part of the sugar industry is sugar industry around students, where young women, and some young men, but overwhelmingly young women, have their tuition paid, and often their living expenses as well, for being available to a wealthy man who then will pay for their tuition and some of their other expenses in exchange for, particularly the student part of the sugar industry, the biggest part, for having this young, attractive woman that they can bring to their business meetings and show off, a young, attractive, articulate woman in graduate school or college, for which he pays their tuition and often their upkeep, and is available usually sexually too. Those are interesting because the contract is written between the sugar worker, the sex worker, and her John, I guess in this case, although it's a John who also enjoys her cultural services and her availability to go to restaurants or shows or business meetings or whatever he wants when he's in town. And in exchange, he pays for her tuition. That is expanding wildly in the United States, as tuition is bizarre. In New York City, it's very widely practiced at NYU, where to graduate for 4 years of undergraduate school will cost you $253,000. And college debt is usually, well, 2/5 of college debt is never paid off in your whole life, because people borrow to go to school hoping that they'll have a lucrative job and never have a job that's lucrative enough to pay that back. Also, I should note that sex work is the only kind of labor in which women are paid more than men, and in which often women who, without a college degree, can make a reasonable living. And in the sugar industry, women, who are most of the sugar babies in the industry, can graduate without tuition debt, unlike many of their male and female peers. They also avoid what many career women want most to avoid, which is getting married, having a child, and being set back in their career by the fact that we have inadequate childcare options that are expensive, or falling in love with somebody and wanting to sacrifice in order to have a child with him and build a life with him. And more women see that as a threat, because ironically enough, one of the predictors of poverty in this country is having a child, sadly, because of the lack of child benefits and maternity and paternity benefits that we have. And so the sugar industry is a burgeoning example of independent workers working in the sex industry, even though the sex here is not the only thing offered. It's company. If a wealthy businessman, let's say, comes to New York several times a year, maybe once a month, then all he has to do is, let the woman know, and then he will pay for her tuition and expenses, often in addition, in order to have an articulate, good-looking woman come with him as a companion to whatever he wants, and to show off to his colleagues that he has this good-looking young woman. So there are a lot of variations towards independent sex work. There's also communal sex work or communist sex work, from each according to his ability to each according to his or her needs, where both parts, both sexual partners, try to both satisfy their own sexual needs and those of a partner. And the point is mutual pleasure, shared pleasure as the proceed. And that is more and more a demand of women. As we have become more empowered and more entitled to our own sexuality, women are more and more demanding that we receive pleasure too, that we're not just there to be screwed, we're there as mutual, equal partners. Now, a lot of men are not prepared for that in sex or anywhere else, which is why the majority of women in the United States are single. Because the deal of having to be a sex worker, a domestic worker, and a social worker for some guy who doesn't even support you because you're working outside the home too is no longer attractive. And so men who want communal or communist relationships of equal sharing can have that. Work it out, although it's a pioneering work because very few people have ever seen that before in the marriages or arrangements of our parents. But that too is possible. So if we look at that, we can look at sex work as who produces sexual pleasure and who gets to appropriate it and enjoy it, and who doesn't. And if we look at the whole morality, there's a whole right-wing morality about sex work that condemns sex work. However, if we look at it the way I suggested, in terms of classes of sex work, class arrangements, I should say, in which sex work is performed, then the immorality is the exploitation, either in slavery or in capitalism, where you're ripping off people, because in slavery you don't give them any money, keep them alive so they can have sex with the people you hire them out to, or in capitalist sex work, where you exploit them. You give them less than they earn for you. That's the basic reason capitalists give wages anyway, but I feel that's immoral to exploit a person, give them less than they're making for you. And so I consider that immoral sex work. Whereas a person who's an independent sex worker, who has sex for money and appropriates that money and uses it for herself or himself, I should include men, because one of the men that has been most impressive is the man that Ted Haggard, the head of the fundamentalists of the United States, had some years ago. He used to leave for a couple of weeks every so often, where he'd go to Chicago, take crystal meth, and hire a prostitute. That prostitute recognized Ted Haggard on television speaking against homosexuality and outed him. He went to the press, and some press would not accept his revelations, even though he had photos with himself and Ted. But others did. In that case, that was a sex worker who risked being known as a sex worker, and sex work is illegal in the United States, and risked personal suffering of his parents knowing he was a sex worker in order to stop the hypocrisy of the fundamentalist movement that hires sex workers and condemns them. A similar thing happened with Jimmy Swaggart, the televangelist, who was outed by prostitutes because after having sex with them, he cheated them out of a lot of their money because he felt it was immoral for them to work as sex workers. That's what he said. It was a moral stance on his part. But he did confess, cry a lot, and then get reinstated. But there again, it was a very courageous woman who came out as a sex worker in order to expose Swaggart's hypocrisy and also his theft of people's wages. So we can look at what are the forces that condemn sex work. They're certainly not those that condemn capitalism, or else they would condemn capitalism and capitalist sex work, or slavery and slave class process being used. That is condemned. You're not allowed to own another person and use them for sex, although people do. In today's Daily News, there's a story about a couple hiring their foster daughters out for prostitution. And if you look up foster children prostituted on Google, you'll find many examples. And that is slavery, because those children are pushed into utter dependence on their foster parents. And that, I think, is immoral. Slavery is immoral, and I think capitalist profiteering is immoral also. But independent sex workers are not immoral. Nobody's being exploited and used and profited from. And so that I think this is really important for two reasons. One is the morality that condemns sex workers is a hypocritical morality. It condemns people for trying to make a living, renting out their sexuality and making a living, not exploiting anyone else, and not doing anything that is, in my book, immoral. And we are quite a hypocritical society around that. It's instrumental that Ted Haggard gave as an excuse for telling his wife and parishioners that he needed time to write and reflect. And that's why he was taking this time off when he was taking crystal meth and hiring a prostitute. He said it was because his wife let herself go. She gained weight. In other words, her job was to sexually satisfy him as a sex object. And if she didn't, he was entitled to exploit someone else's sexuality. That didn't go over very well, but he tried it. In any case, sex is one of those many areas where women are condemned and where exploitation is not condemned. And it's very important for us to get it straight. Sex work can be honest work. Sex work should not be criminalized. What should be criminalized is slavery, and I think capitalism, using people to make money off of them and not giving them the money that their work has earned. And it's a very different take on sex work from what you usually hear. And I must say that those people who are condemning prostitutes are usually using them instead. One of the biggest cooperatives in the world, which is a communist idea, a communal idea, is in India, where they have a 20,000 strong sex workers cooperative. And the sex workers talk about how the same people at the bank who had sex with them the evening before won't give them a loan the next day. So they had to start their own cooperative and own their own bank because of the hypocrisy involved. And those are communal sex workers. They all work for the sex workers' commune. They all pool their earnings, and they all benefit. And they benefit from the sanitary napkin factory that they have, from the bank that they run for themselves, and from the birth control purchasing power that they have, so that they can give each other loans, educate their children, and live decently. And it's in Calcutta, India, one of the poorest sections of a poor country, that they have done this, and they have changed their lives through communal labor. That's the class process that they're part of, a communal class process. And so, in summary, I would want to say that we should really condemn exploitation rather than sexuality, and condemn exploitative sexual practices rather than mutually pleasuring communal sexuality. Communal sexuality is one of the things that more and more women are demanding, and more men have trouble with. One of the reasons that men give in books on the sugar industry is that the gender dynamics of another sexual relationship are too complicated. They want to buy their way out of those dynamics. In other words, they don't want to learn how to treat women as equals and consider them. They want their money to buy their ascendancy, pretty much the way it used to when marriage deprived women of our sexual independence and was a kind of signing yourself up for a feudal relationship in which the man used your services, including your sexual services, and you got to live and have a share of the cleanliness and cooking or servant management or whatever, if the woman was a feudal household manager, and access to children and social connections and emotional care that women were supposed to give in marriage in exchange for a small share of those things and a home to live in. So that what I hope we can get out of this is two things. One is that class is a very useful tool in analyzing a whole bunch of things in both personal life and also political and economic life. It doesn't have to stop at the threshold. It can go right into the bedroom. So that's one thing that's important to learn, that class relationships, who works and who gets the benefit, are important to analyze. And Marxian class categories are very useful for that analysis. And the other is that our morality that many are taught is completely off. It doesn't respect that what's immoral is exploiting someone, taking more than you should, taking a share of their work and not giving it back to them. That's immoral, that's theft. And not getting on some high runaway moral horse of condemning people for doing sex work, which is born out of economic necessity. Thank you very much for listening. If you're inspired to, please be a Patreon member and commit to us. This is brought to you by Democracy at Work. Democracy at Work deserves our thanks. So thank you. Hope you tune in again next week. From Capitalism Hits Home and Harriet Fraad. Goodbye.